The machines had stopped beeping in the rhythm of hope and started beeping in the rhythm of goodbye. And that is the sound Richard Ashford would remember for the rest of his life. Ask yourself, if the doctors in white coats stood in front of you and said there was nothing left to do, that your child's heart had maybe hours left to beat, what would you do with the money, the power, the name that had opened every door in your life except this one? Richard Ashford had built an empire out of steel and glass towers across 3 states. But in that hospital room in Denver, Colorado, none of it meant anything at all. His son, 9-year-old Thomas Ashford, lay under a tangle of tubes, his small chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths, and the specialists flown in, from New York and Boston, had already said the words no father should ever have to hear. Rare autoimmune failure attacking his own heart tissue, they called it, a condition so uncommon that only a handful of cases existed in medical literature, and none of those children had lived past their 10th birthday. Richard sat by the bed with his tie loosened, and his eyes red from 3 sleepless nights, and for the first time since he was a boy, sleeping in the back of his father's pickup truck, he felt utterly powerless. He had once believed that enough money could buy anything, cure anything, fix anything. But here, in this sterile room, with the low hum of machines and the smell of antiseptic thick in the air, he understood that some things simply could not be purchased. His wife had passed 3 years earlier, and Thomas was all he had left of the family he had once dreamed of building, and now even that was slipping through his fingers like sand no matter how tightly he tried to hold on. Outside the hospital, on a cracked sidewalk 2 blocks away, a boy named Caleb Whitfield sat wrapped in a thin gray blanket that had once been white, his back against a brick wall still warm from the day's sun. Caleb was 12 years old, though hunger and hardship had aged his eyes far beyond his years. He had been living on the streets of Denver for almost 8 months, ever since his mother had passed from an illness the family could never afford to treat properly, and his father had disappeared into a haze of grief and addiction not long after. Caleb did not beg, not really. He simply sat near the hospital entrance because the vents there blew warm air in the evenings, and sometimes a kind nurse leaving her shift would hand him a sandwich wrapped in a napkin, without saying a word. What almost nobody in that city knew, because Caleb never spoke of it to anyone, was that before his mother died, she had spent 2 years working as a home health aide for an elderly cardiac nurse who had grown fond of the quiet, curious boy who tagged along on her shifts. That old nurse, half out of boredom and half out of love for a child who reminded her of her own son, had taught Caleb things most children his age never think to learn. She taught him how to listen to a heartbeat and recognize when it stumbled, how to recognize the subtle blue tinge of oxygen deprivation on fingertips and lips, how certain rare conditions responded not to the newest medicines but to older, almost forgotten techniques that had fallen out of fashion in modern hospitals obsessed with pharmaceutical solutions. Caleb had absorbed it all like a sponge, not because he ever imagined he would need it, but because in those days, sitting beside that old woman, learning was the only thing that made him feel like his life had a shape and a purpose. That evening, as Caleb sat outside the hospital watching the sun sink behind the mountains, he saw a man stumble out through the sliding glass doors, a man in an expensive suit that looked as wrinkled and exhausted as its owner. Richard Ashford walked out simply to breathe, to escape the 4 walls that had begun to feel like a coffin, closing in around him, and he did not notice the boy on the sidewalk until he nearly tripped over the edge of the blanket. Richard mumbled an apology out of pure reflex, the kind wealthy men give without truly seeing the person in front of them, and he might have kept walking if Caleb had not spoken the words that stopped him cold. The boy asked quietly whether the child upstairs, the one all the nurses had been whispering about, was having trouble with his heart rhythm and turning blue around the lips in the evenings. Richard turned back slowly, stunned that a homeless child on a sidewalk somehow knew details about his son's condition that even some of the visiting specialists had struggled to explain to him in plain language. If you were Richard in that moment, exhausted, broken, clinging to whatever thread of hope remained, would you have dismissed the boy as a stranger rambling nonsense, or would you have paused just long enough to listen? Richard chose to listen, perhaps because he had nothing left to lose, and Caleb explained, in the careful, measured way his mother's old employer had once explained things to him. That certain rare autoimmune heart conditions worsened, not from the disease alone, but from how the body was being positioned and treated during flare episodes, and that a specific combination of controlled breathing, positioning, and a nearly forgotten, manual technique to regulate blood flow to the heart had once saved a similar patient decades earlier, back when hospitals had fewer machines and doctors relied more on their hands and their instincts. Richard should have walked away. Every instinct of a man who had spent his life in boardrooms surrounded by experts told him to dismiss the ragged boy on the sidewalk as delusional. But something in Caleb's steady, sorrowful eyes that had clearly seen loss up close, made Richard hesitate. Richard invited Caleb inside, against the disapproving stares of hospital security, and brought him to speak with Thomas's lead physician, a tired but compassionate woman named Dr. Susan Whitmore, who had exhausted every modern protocol she knew. She was skeptical, understandably so, dismissing the input of a homeless 12-year-old boy as an act of desperation from a grieving father. But Richard, remembering the fierce clarity in Caleb's voice, quietly asked her to simply listen, just once, before writing it off completely. Caleb, trembling slightly under the weight of every eye now on him, described the exact technique his mother's mentor had taught him, the way to elevate Thomas slightly at a precise angle, the breathing pattern that could ease pressure on the struggling heart valve, the gentle, rhythmic pressure applied near the collarbone that in rare cases restored a failing heart's electrical signal long enough for medication to finally take hold. Dr. Whitmore, more out of desperation than belief, agreed to try it, as Thomas's vitals began crashing again that very night, the monitors screaming their frantic warning. Nurses moved quickly, but this time, following Caleb's quiet, steady instructions relayed through Dr. T. Whitmore, they repositioned Thomas exactly as he described. Richard stood frozen at the doorway, his heart pounding as hard as his son's monitor, silently pleading with whatever force controlled fate to give this dying child a chance. For nearly 90 agonizing seconds, nothing happened, and Richard felt his knees nearly buckle beneath him, certain he was about to lose everything. And then, almost impossibly, Thomas's heartbeat steadied. The wild, erratic spikes on the monitor softened into a slow, rhythmic pulse, and the harsh blue tinge slowly faded from his lips as oxygen finally reached where it needed to go. The room fell into stunned silence, the kind of silence that follows a miracle nobody quite believes they just witnessed. Dr. Whitmore stood frozen, staring at the monitor as though it might betray her at any second, but the heartbeat held steady, then steadier still. Richard collapsed into the chair beside his son's bed, tears streaming freely down his face, gripping Thomas's small hand, as though letting go might undo whatever had just happened. It would take several more days of careful monitoring, adjusted medication, and repeated application of the technique Caleb had shared. But slowly, miraculously, Thomas began to stabilize in ways the doctors could not fully explain through textbooks alone. News of what happened spread quietly through the hospital staff first, then beyond its walls. The story of a homeless boy who had done what an entire team of specialists could not. Richard Ashford, a man who had once measured worth in dollar signs and quarterly earnings, found himself utterly humbled by a boy who owned nothing but a torn blanket and a memory of his grandmother's teachings. He asked Caleb, once Thomas was finally stable enough to breathe on his own without machines, what he could possibly do to repay a debt that felt immeasurable. Caleb, still that same quiet, humble boy, simply said he did not do it for money. He did it because he remembered what it felt like to watch someone he loved slip away, with no one able to help. And he never wanted another child to feel what he had felt. Richard could not simply let the boy vanish back onto the streets after that. He arranged for Caleb to have a stable place to live, enrolled him in a proper school, and made certain he would never again spend a night shivering under a blanket on a cold sidewalk. But more than that, Richard saw something rare and remarkable in this boy's mind. His gift for understanding the human body, and his instinct for compassion that no classroom could ever teach. He funded Caleb's education fully, promising to support him through medical school one day, if that was the path he wished to walk. And slowly, over the following months, a bond formed between them that neither money nor tragedy had created, but shared suffering and shared hope had. Thomas recovered fully within the year, growing strong enough to run and laugh and play the way children are meant to, and he and Caleb became inseparable, brothers bound not by blood but by circumstance and gratitude. Richard often found himself watching the two boys together, marveling at how a homeless child, with nothing to his name, had given him back everything that mattered. He had spent decades believing that wealth defined a person's worth, but Caleb had taught him, without ever meaning to, that the truest wealth in this world is kindness, offered freely when someone has every reason to walk away instead. If this story moved something inside you, if it made you think about the strangers we overlook every single day, who might be carrying more wisdom and more heart than we could ever imagine, please take a moment to comment and share what part touched you the most. Years later, Caleb Whitfield did walk the halls of a hospital again, not as a homeless boy sitting outside in the cold, but as a young medical student, inspired by an old nurse who once believed in him, and a billionaire who once knelt beside him on a sidewalk with nothing left but hope. And somewhere in that hospital, a photograph still hung quietly in Dr. Tu Whitmore's office. A picture of two boys, one born into wealth and one born into hardship, standing together, forever changed by a single night when the impossible became real. If this story touched your heart even a little, please like this video. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. Share it with someone who needs a little hope today. And subscribe for more stories that remind us of the quiet miracles still hidden in this world.